Howdy folks, Justin here. Today we are going to take a look at the deck that I've been playing for this last week and kind of evolving and working on with a brand new change that I used to get to rank 1 last night on a really nice set of games that I've really enjoyed, that adds that extra spice that I'm really looking for when I'm building Legends decks. Something you don't see a lot. I'm trying to find cards that aren't played a lot, and yeah, I had to give it a shot, and I've really been impressed with it so far. But we'll start with the top and just move our way through the list, and I'll explain all the choices in it. So Execute is fairly straightforward. This is fantastic against Archer in the early game, fantastic against um, Assassin, and pretty good against Tempo Mage, Action Mage, if you will. I guess is a more accurate way to describe that deck. Just on this page alone, it's a little covered up by my ugly mug, but Descendant of Alkosh, great target for Execute. Just a note on Execute. Against Scout, it's going to be really tempting sometimes to execute things like Thieves Guild Recruits and Fighters Guild Recruits. That's usually not the best use of this spell. It can be sometimes, but a few other side notes against Battle Mage lately, and also against Spellsword, although against Sorcerer, although it's rare these days. Execute is incredible. It gets rid of the 2/2 with Ward that gives you a Tome of Alteration when it loses Ward. It gets rid of the 1/1 with Ward that gives you a 5/5 with Guard when it loses its Ward. Execute has some high value targets against those two decks, so I would encourage you to use them sparingly and go ahead and just take some damage in the early game from things like opposing Windkeep spell swords or you know, anything really, because you really need to execute those. Um, Rumor Profiteer, kind of an underrated card, I think. I think it's actually really bad in tokens. I think in tokens you probably want to take some face damage and get your runes broken so you can continue drawing cards, which is a problem that deck has. But Rumor Profiteer is great in this deck because, and you may have noticed this if you've watched some of my videos before, from the Scout deck to the Sorcerer deck to the Monk deck to this, I tend to build decks that operate like this, right? Early game, I gain card advantage by taking damage. I get a couple of my runes broken, and then I claw back, and then I try to put the game into a position in the mid and late game where my opponent's in top deck mode, and I'm holding on to a whole bunch of answers. Broomer Profiteer is actually a lot more useful in this regard than I think it's ever been in any sort of more aggressive deck. Uh, Another reason that I'm running this instead of, and this is what I was running at first, the Kvatch Soldier, is that Broomer Profiteer has 3 attack, which is huge. Being able to trade into House Kinsman, being able to trade into Werebats, of course, those cards are about to be nerfed to 2 health, in which case we might do a reassessment here, but it is just super relevant. It can trade into a Daring Cutpurse that's pilfered once. The 3 attack is clutch, and it's the kind of card that, especially against Archer, you just want to go ahead and drop this on the board and just trade it into something, because you want to minimize the damage you're taking so that Burn and Pillage hits you less hard. And the life gain trigger on Broom of Profiteer actually makes it so you can pull ahead of the Archer deck in life if you plot your early turns well enough. Windkeep Spellsword is just, a super effective card. It's the shielded mini bot from Hearthstone. It's easy to get a 2-for-1 with this in the early game. It eats alive opposing Thieves Guild Recruits. I'm sorry, Fighters Guild Recruits, the one with lethal Prophecy and Guard. This is a really high value creature. Don't hesitate to lay it down in opposition to a Mournhold Trader, the 4/4 green creature for 2 that has Last Gasp, give you a 2/1 with Guard, because you're going to end up taking 4 or 8 damage from that thing, but this thing can trade with it. Just a really great card. Probably the worst top deck in the deck later on in the game, but you kind of have to run some cards like this, or you run into the problem that my Sorcerer deck ran into, where you're just not running enough early game at all. Crushing Blow, one of the best cards in the game. Excellent removal. You always want this in your opening hand. The exception of this is probably against Sorcerer Ward decks. It's just not that good there. And against Control Mage, if you know your opponent's playing Control Mage, go ahead and throw this back because your strategy against Control Mage is much different. Dawnstar Healer, along with Bruma Profiteer and Night Shadow, is how you claw back in the mid to late game after you've taken some licks in the beginning and drawn a few extra cards. Dawnstar Healer is incredibly powerful when you hit both of them on the board, and there are only two, but when you get both of them on the board, you can gain ludicrous amounts of life very quickly. Again, part of the key to the success of this deck is recognizing that oftentimes Bruma Profiteer is just a 3-2, and Dawnstar Healer is just a 3-3, and you just need to slam them into your opponent's creatures so you can get to the point where you're playing your 4s and 5s, which are very powerful cards. Histgrove, one of the alternate win conditions in this deck. Mulligan them, don't keep them. Except, again, maybe if you're feeling greedy against a deck you know is a Battle Mage, Atromancer deck, or potentially against Control Mage, although a lot of them are running Vicious Dreg to remove it. This is just not a card you need in the early game. It's a card you want to hold on to. I would hesitate to play this card unless you're plotting. You have an Odiving in hand, or you have a Blood Magic Lord in hand, and you know you're going to play that card, the following turn or a couple turns later, just because the risk of it being removed is pretty high. Although ramping it by itself isn't bad. So we run the full 3 copies. Treeminder, we're only running 2 Treeminders in this version, in this list. Another ramp spell. You do need to draw a total of 3 Histgroves and/or Treeminders to trigger Histgrove. But the Histgrove Treeminder package is really most effective against Control Mage, against Control Monk, against other Control Spellsword decks, and those are the games where you frequently are going to have the opportunity to draw a lot of cards, get pretty deep in your deck, and so it shines there. Treeminder is just great too as a guard creature. I mean, keeping a little bit of that damage from hitting your face is always welcome. Young Mammoth is just one of the best statted creatures in the game. Fantastic trade against opposing creatures, and this sort of goes along with a theme that the deck has as the cards go on. You're looking at a lot of cards that, even though you're not drawing extra cards, because somebody asked me about this, like I'm running out of cards, you really, just like in the Scout deck that I played for a few seasons and that I still really enjoy, you really need to leverage your cards to maximum efficiency to be successful with this list. Young Mammoth is a card that's a little more obvious how you're going to do that, but the same principle applies to things like Windkeep Spellsword, where you need to gain every small advantage you can in order to make this deck work. Young Mammoth, of course, like I said, pretty obvious how you make that happen. It's just a giant creature, but Cloudrest Illusionist is the new addition to this deck, and I love it. I've been having so much success with Cloudrest Illusionist, and this fits perfectly in what I was saying about Windkeep Spellsword and Young Mammoth. This card lets you make some really favorable trades, and without drawing cards, gain card advantage. Don't hesitate to use this on an opposing Fighters Guild recruit that your Mammoth is mournfully sitting across from. It's a pretty good prophecy too. It brings the number of prophecies in the deck up a little bit higher than it was. Coming in at 3 of these piercing javelins, 2 midnight sweeps, and 2 Cloudrest Illusionist. We're not relying on prophecies to do much of anything, but it's a good one to hit, and it's a 4/3 for 4. Again, the same thing goes with this as goes with the Dawnstar Healer and Windkeep Spellsword. Don't hesitate to just throw this down to attack an opposing creature. 4 power on a 4 attack on a 4 cost creature is a fine rate and should trade pretty well. Edict of Azura, this is the best removal spell in the game in my opinion, and it's part of the reason we're only running 2 Shadowfen Priests. 5 main deck answers to support cards gives us a lot of answers against opposing Treeminder decks, and gives us a lot of answers to opposing creatures in general. As with Piercing Javelin, the one thing I would say about these cards is if you suspect your opponent is running Markarth Bannerman, go ahead and hold on to one of these because you're going to want to remove that card. Hive Defender, just excellent stats for its cost. It's a really hard card for a lot of decks to deal with, including notably Control Mage has a pretty difficult time removing this without just throwing their own guard down against it. This helps transition to the point of the game where you're gaining control of the board. Midnight Sweep, probably I would say a lot of the time a better prophecy trigger than piercing javelin. Um, but this is another one of those cards where with a single card you're generating effective card advantage because you can frequently against the decks that it's most useful against, archer, assassin, aggro crusader. Get a 2-for-1 off of this thing. So I definitely like it. We're only running 2 Preserve of the Roots. In the early versions of this list, I was running Sench Tiger because I suffered brain damage in my 20s and forgot that Preserve of the Root existed. Preserve of the Root's great. It's a 4-4 for 4, which is a fine rate. Again, same thing goes with this. This goes with the Mammoth, the Illusionist, the Healer, and the Profiteer. Don't hesitate to just throw this down to turn 4 to trade into something. But in the late game, it gives you, additional guard creatures to make sure that you can fill holes in the lanes where your opponent might be trying to sneak back in. Piercing Javelin, what needs to be said, incredibly powerful prophecy, destroy a creature, hold on to these for high value targets. Um, Shadowfin Priest, just a really solid card. Don't forget the trick that you can use silence cover in the shadow lane to slam into it with your guard creature that you hopefully have positioned there already. Um, really solid. It does a lot of work against Crystal Tower Keeper or whatever, the blue 2/2 that gives +1/+1 when you play in action. Does a lot of work against Slaughterfish individually, of course. Um, but there are a lot of other targets that you're going to see come up, such as House Kinsman, which is definitely a reasonable silence target a lot of the time. Night Shadow, this is part of the comeback package in the deck. It's very difficult for a lot of decks to remove. Even Burn and Pillage won't kill this unless you're at 5, or if you're unless you're at 5 life or below already. Just a really powerful card. It is a vampire, so if your opponent's running Dawnbreaker, sorry, it happens. But yeah, I just really enjoy running this card. I think it's very powerful. Um, it's important once you get more familiar with playing the deck that you recognize that sometimes it's a better idea not to put your opponent to 26 in the early game because you know that you don't want to draw them cards or trigger their prophecies, but putting them at 26 means you're giving them 2 cards when you hit them with that Night Shadow and you're trying to swing back into the game, and that can be devastating sometimes, especially against decks like Prophecy Assassin. So if you can keep them at 27 instead, that's not a bad move. Nahagleave, just a really solid card. Again, a lot of decks have trouble answering this. Archer is not one of them, so don't rely on Nahagleave to do a lot of work against Archer unless you've already put your opponent into top deck mode. But yeah, it's just a really useful creature. Blood Magic Lord, this is part of the finish off the game package we have here. Um, Pro tip, I mean I'm not a pro, but the expression. Hanging on to Raise Dead until after your opponent kills your Blood Magic Lord is a really good idea. It's frequently going to happen. And your deck is actually filled with a lot of pretty high value creatures. There are a few exceptions to this. But hanging on to Blood Magic Lord until turn 11 is, of course, best. Sometimes you don't have that option. Um, it's just a really powerful card. It's a good way to win the game. And if you're not killing your opponent that turn or maybe the next turn, I would always prioritize attacking an opposing creature with Blood Magic Lord and getting an extra Blood Magic spell over attacking your opponent's face. Manticora, incredibly powerful card. This helps win you the game, and being able to ramp into it sometimes with the Hissgrove and Treeminder really puts it over the top in terms of power level. It'll stop a Tazcad dead in its tracks. They'll still get the token, but it'll do some work there, so that's something to keep in mind. Marak the Dragonborn, Amazeballs card. I heard someone say that the other day. If you can steal a creature with Drain, steal a creature with Drain, but don't get greedy. Just take something. Take a guard or a Drain creature if you can, but just take something. In some ways, it's your 4th Manticora is really how you should just look at it. Finally, Odoving, insane card. We could be running Iron Atronach, but and to be honest, the fact that there aren't nearly as many other decks running Manticora right now as there were a few months back when I stopped playing Iron Atronach is a reason where you might want to run Iron Atronach, and I can understand running it. Although it doesn't really fit with how I play the deck, it wouldn't be a huge deviation from the general strategy to run it. But I think Odoving's just generally better. If Odoving's in your hand and you're at 9 Magicka, you can sort of plot your next few turns around playing Odoving and win the game that way. It's just an incredibly powerful card. So anyway, that's the list. A few notes about cards I didn't include. Ravenous Hunger. You may notice I don't even have more than one of these. I have actually been seeing this card more lately. I don't think it's bad. I think it is as good as there are. Its playability is inversely connected to the number of um, scout decks in the format. You know, it's not a bad choice. It's a playable card. If you have these and you don't have, say, Night Shadow, you might as well run them. But it's really only good in the Shadow lane, and it's really, I mean, that one toughness is just brutal. East March Crusader. So again, back to how I personally build decks, and if you've seen the original Scout list, the Sorcerer deck, and this, you kind of see I'm trying to kill my opponent after I have just exhausted the game. And East March Crusader, while a very good card, just doesn't really fit in how I'm playing this deck. I think you could definitely have a lot of success with East March Crusader. I think you could probably play this deck by removing Histgrove, Treeminder, Cloud of Illusionist, and running East March Crusader and say another 2-drop creature. That's just not how I'm choosing to run it, but that's definitely something to consider if you're looking for a little change. Dawnbreaker, I like Dawnbreaker in decks that have cheaper drain creatures than I'm running. Dawnbreaker is good, but our matchup against Scout, which is where you're going to get the random undead slaying, is already pretty good. Much better against Ramp and Control Scout than against Midrange Scout, which is I'm not going to say it's unfavorable, but it's not favorable either. It's a wash. But Dawnbreaker, it just didn't wasn't creating as much utility as I found necessary, and I feel like the body attached to Cloudless Illusionist can often have the same sort of impact on the board, while also leaving a creature behind, so therefore being much more flexible. I had to craft these, by the way. You may notice I have two, and there's two in the deck. Riverhold Escort was a card I played in the first couple versions of this deck because I like the card, but couldn't make it work. I mean, it's good against a couple decks, but not good against most. Regini Highwayman, another card I really seriously considered playing, but just was never able to get effective value out of. And unlike a lot of the other kind of sort of utility creatures we're running, a 2/2 for 3 is hard to get much value out of. Yeah, that's basically it. I mean, of course, I've tried Auroran Sentry. It just doesn't do it for me. I got my Golden Saint here. Golden Saint, that you're not playing Golden Saint. You're often stabilizing it like between 1 and 5 life. It's not Golden Saint Rain. And yeah, I talked about Iron Atronach. A quick note about one last card. That card is Enchanted Plate. This card I don't think is particularly good. I mean, like, it's got a lot going for it. 2 Magicka for 3 stats and a card is a very reasonable rate. However, um, you basically usually don't have time to be doing something like that with this deck. And Enchanted Plate has its place. It's just, I don't think it's in this deck. Also, I would be hesitant to run that card in general. Not a huge fan of it. Mummify, I don't really need Mummify. We've got so much other removal that bypasses wards and stuff. Frostbite Spider, if you're really into Prophecy, you could build a version of this deck that was just chock full of prophecies, and it would probably be reasonably successful. Frostbite Spider would be the first one I include in that, even though it's never played and constructed. I think it's a pretty reasonable card. And yeah, that's about it. Um, this deck is a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed playing it. I'm going to take it to Legend in the next day or two. I'm sitting at rank 1 right now. And I hope that you have an opportunity to try it out. I'd love to hear your feedback. I've been reading the comments. I'm down to replying to comments on YouTube once a week, just because I'm getting so many, and I work 6 days a week, so I don't have a whole lot of time to do that. But yeah, thank you very much for joining me for Spellsword Week. We're not done. Tomorrow we have a little bit a special Spellsword activity, and it's funny. I'll tell you real quick. I actually recorded okay, so I was like, I'm gonna do a versus arena run with Spellsword. And by the way, if you don't know this, Spellsword is pretty terrible most of the time in versus arena. So I queued up for versus arena Spellsword, not an option. So I played one with Monk, went 5-3. Queued up again, paid my 150 gold again, got Spellsword. I'm like, awesome. Started recording, and I am 5-2 in the middle of a game, and my computer just crashes, completely crashes. Screen freezes, like buzzing noise coming from it. And because I didn't, hit the stop recording button on OBS, I have this file that will not play. So there's a possibility we'll be doing a versus arena run or solo arena run with Spellsword. God, solo arena run sounds even worse with Spellsword tomorrow. But if that doesn't pan out, I do have something else special planned for Spellsword week to kind of cap things off, and I hope to see you all there. So thank you very much. If you have any suggestions for class, I know you're all going to say warrior, but if you have a suggestion for a class that you'd like to see me do a focus on like this again, we'll do that. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and it's a class I never really gave a whole lot of attention to um, until I forced myself to, and I'm having a blast playing it. So, thanks for joining me, and I will see you all on the ladder.